Thank you for joining us for this edition of VaxTalks Roundtable. I'm Brad Satin, and our topic today is called Looking Ahead, COVID Vaccines for Kids. Our roundtable comprises members of the Board of Directors and the Scientific Advisory Board of We Vax. Moderating today is Dr. Nicole Roberts. She's the Executive Director of Feed a Billion and a Global Health Policy Advisor. Dr. Teri Heiland, Co-founder and Chief Scientific Officer at Immunomic Therapeutics. Dr. Stephen R. Luber, Associate Clinical Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Washington Medical School, and Dr. Sina Bavari, Chief Scientific Officer at Helion Bio and the former Science Director of the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. Certainly a distinguished panel of experts for our topic today, Looking Ahead, COVID Vaccines for Kids. And with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Nicole Roberts. Nicole?
Thank you for that introduction, Brad. You know, as we prepare for a return to school in the fall, and parents have to prepare their children this summer for what that looks like, it's really important that we take some time to understand where things stand with children and COVID, specifically because there's also been some misunderstanding that COVID in children has, a different effect and isn't as important. And yet 24% of recent cases of COVID have been in children. And so this is a very timely conversation. And I want to get started right away. So Stephen, I'm actually going to come to you first. And I want to ask a few fact-based questions before we get into more of the nuance and I ask you guys your opinions about things. So just to get us started, can you tell us what vaccines have been authorized for children to date in late May? And when will younger children of different age categories either be eligible or are they already? And, what's going on with current age requirements and age groups?
The Pfizer vaccine has emergency use authorization for ages 12 to 16. It is the only vaccine that's currently available for young people. There are no classifications within that age bracket. We would expect clinical trials to be completed late this year for age 2 to 12.
Okay, thank you. And, Sina, I'll ask you next, now that we know only one, is the amount of the Pfizer vaccine given to children any different than it is for adults?
Not that I know of. No, I think it's a similar amount. So,
okay.
And it's if I may continue, also.
Of course.
As a father of 6 and few kids that are still in school, and both of my kids are in school. Actually, we went ahead and they got the vaccination. There are absolutely no issues. One of them actually, she's going to be getting her second vaccination. So she's celebrating the second vaccination with a bunch of her other friends who all got vaccinated at the same time. So I think, this is sort of or at least for my kids, is a celebratory mood at that point. And my 13-year-old, she got her first vaccination last week. So she actually called a bunch of her friends and they had a vaccine party, if you believe it or not. It was online vaccine party, but they're hoping to actually get the online vaccine party into a real party in the back of our house. So, yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, actually, so since you said that your children have recently done this, I'll stick with you for just a second. So, where can children get vaccinated? And then a secondary question to that is, if children have gotten other vaccinations recently, is there any sort of difference in when they can get them? Can they get them all at once in the same place? How does that work?
Yeah, I think my kids got the same, they were vaccinated at the same place actually as I was vaccinated. So it wasn't a big deal. They have to get Pfizer vaccine. So and at least in Frederick County in Maryland, where we live, they actually offer both Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. So it was fairly painless to actually get them vaccinated. And I like to sort of split the vaccination apart a little bit, but there are a lot of childhood vaccination that you can actually get 3 or 4 of them at the same time. Right now, just because we just don't understand enough about these vaccines, I think it's probably best and safest probably to keep them maybe 10 days to 14 days apart. But, I think that's probably going to be soon. I think that's going to come out that you probably can mix all of these vaccines together also. And that would be my guess. At some point in the near future, I think you're probably going to be able to mix all these vaccines together. And other people probably may have other ideas about that. So,
No, I'll just jump in real quick and say my son, who's 14, will be getting his first vaccine next week. And they actually set up a clinic at the high school he's getting ready to enter in the fall. So I think, at least with the school systems, they're trying to make it convenient for the kids that want to get vaccinated. And it certainly hasn't been the issue that it was when, as adults, we struggled to get in line. So I think that they are making it easier for kids to get them at different clinics at the high schools or the middle schools.
I have been giving vaccines at middle schools up to this point. I've been to 3 clinics, and we are going to the middle schools in our district. And it's interesting, the parents seem to be somewhat hesitant, but the students don't. To them, it's liberation. They can't wait for 5 weeks from now when they can go out and play. They can indulge in indoor athletics. They can go party. They can be adolescents. And the vaccine resistance you see is mainly in the parents, but the children are embracing it just fine. The CDC has just released data that it is okay to give the vaccines at the same time as other vaccines. And since we have now probably 40% of our children behind in their vaccination schedule, I just take any chance I can get to give a kid a vaccine. So I would urge everyone to do it as much as possible.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And I love that word you used, liberation. It's a great mindset. So with everyone getting the COVID vaccine in particular, are there any side effects that are different between children and adults that we should know about? And if so, what are they?
Well, I think if you've tuned into the news lately, there seems to be a few cases of the myocarditis or the inflammation of the heart. But I don't believe at this time that they can say that it's associated with the vaccine. There are other viruses that obviously can cause this inflammation. There may be an increase that are coming on with the summer, but I think it's certainly too early to associate it with the vaccine. But, I think this all goes to transparency. And so it's good that I think we're being transparent, that if we think there may be an issue that, that's really explored. Of course, with any of these vaccines, anytime there's a side effect, it's always noted, but you don't hear about it. So I think with the COVID vaccine, I think the transparency has been good.
Great. And what specifically about children who have allergies? Stephen, you specifically mentioned, getting multiple vaccines caught up because we've fallen behind over the past year. So are there any special considerations or recommendations for children with allergies?
I don't think that the common vaccine hesitancy due to anaphylactic reactions really applies to this vaccine. Always have available resuscitation equipment if necessary, but I would not hesitate to vaccinate any child regardless of their common allergy situation.
Okay. And so now I want to ask some questions that are a bit more opinion oriented. And Teri, I'm going to start with you. You talked about schools earlier. So in your opinion, and then I'd love to hear from the other panelists, should schools require COVID vaccines for children? And if so or not, why do you believe that?
Yeah, I mean, that is the $1 million question, right? We know that there are a number of colleges that are obviously making it mandatory. And then again, it's really going to come down to the states, but I think there's a lot of legal and political and ethical questions that are involved in setting up this type of requirement for the COVID vaccines, especially since they are still under, emergency use authorization. And basically what that means is that it allows doctors to administer these shots more quickly. But, the FDA is still heavily involved. And when they will, make these available for regulated use, it's a rubber stamp. Emergency is just as critical as far as safety and everything else that goes along with a vaccine. So I think, in talking to other parents, that has actually been a question of doubt. Like, why do I want to give my child a vaccine that's only been approved for emergency use? And so I think there really needs to be some education on the difference between emergency use and a license or approval. And really there's not a lot of difference. And so, I think as we've all said on this panel, it's definitely more important to give the vaccine and not be too concerned on what's going on in the background.
So if I may add just a little bit to this, I think it's important there is some distinction, obviously, between emergency use and fully licensed vaccine. It's very difficult, for example, for federal government to mandate things or other places to mandate that they have to get it if it's not licensed. Yeah, but let's say the vaccines would actually come across that line and they become licensed, let's say by end of this year. I think that's what we should look forward to. Then what? I think it should be mandated, just like all the other vaccines are mandated. And I think since we are that close to having these EUA becoming reality and becoming licensed vaccines, I think the schools should be thinking about that type of scenario more than leaning towards, well, there's still EUA and we have a way out. And that's how I look at it. I think I think right now the decisions are being punted in a way for later on, but that decision has to be made, I think, a lot sooner than people think that they have to make the decision.
I think it's important to recognize that the Supreme Court 100 years ago approved the mandatory use of vaccines for entrance into public schools. So there's adequate legal authorizations for this idea. Well, certainly, the school nurses are busy every fall maintaining all the other vaccines which are required for entry into school. The legal restriction on an EUA versus fully approved vaccine certainly will have to be overcome before you can require it by law. Yeah. I know Pfizer just put in for full authorization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. And Sina, I want to come back to you, thinking about when Teri first started to answer that question, she said to think about the legal, ethical, and political simultaneous issues happening around these vaccines in children. So have other similar vaccines ever been used in children before?
Well, actually, I don't know of one like that, but maybe somebody else in the panel that's more knowledgeable can answer that question. I just don't know of another one like this. Now, I think there are other circumstances that come in mind also that maybe goes beyond just political reasons or even scientific reasons. Sometimes it's really more of let me give you my own scenario. Yeah, so I have my mom and my dad who are living with us. 84 and 87-year-old. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to say the age, but they're older. Yeah, so, and my kids actually been very, very scared of getting my mom and dad infected. So instead of single masking, they actually are double masking because they don't want to get my mom and dad infected. I mean, my daughters were so concerned that they would actually take extra precaution to make sure that they're not getting my mom and dad infected, because they don't want that in their mind that, oh my God, I got my grandfather, grandmother infected, and what do I do now? So that's why I think that was one of the first reasons that they jumped on getting the vaccine, because for them it's more of a safety issue also. So it goes, I think, beyond just politics and science. I think a lot of other scenarios that's within the school and at the home setting that may actually push people to do the right thing.
Certainly. And Teri or Stephen, do you know if any other similar vaccines have ever been used in children before?
Not for the RNA. These are the first RNA vaccines that have been in humans. And I'll just add to that. I also think it's one of the most harmless vaccines as well. I think children have gotten vaccines that work very well that they're inactivated, they're live attenuated. This is a nucleic acid that doesn't integrate into the DNA. It's very transient, and we're happy to see it working so well. So I think, I've always been asked that question about, well, we don't know much about, this type of modality, the type of vaccine that they're giving. And, my answer is that it's probably the least harmful of all the vaccines that adults and children get together. So that's just my opinion on that.
And Stephen, anything to add?
Yeah, I think the vaccine itself is very harmless, and I totally agree with Teri. I think what comes in mind is the addition of other things to keep the vaccine actually active that may raise some concern, but I think the vaccine now has been in millions of people. And I think if there's been any issues, we would have seen something at least. Well, if you really think about it, the initial phase 1 studies and phase 2 studies were done last year in February, March timeframe. So we have over a year now and millions of people. I think there's a lot of safety data now available to suggest that these vaccines are as safe as any other vaccines, probably more safer. And I totally agree with Teri. I think we do have live attenuated vaccines. We have inactivated vaccines that sometimes they date back to 60 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think the technology has substantially improved since 60 years ago.
I have served as principal investigator for most of the common childhood vaccines in clinical trials and have cataloged side effects on a consistent basis. And this group of vaccines is just remarkable. Remarkable not only for their safety, but for their efficacy. Who would have dreamed when this all started that you would have 95% efficacy when you were shooting for 70 or 60%?
Absolutely.
Remarkable vaccines to be embraced by all.
I think that's so important. And actually, that's the perfect place to sort of pause and talk about children being studied in clinical trials. So how many children have been studied and for how long? Teri, I'll come to you.
Well, I'm the numbers in the clinical trials are in the thousands, but I can say as of May 13th, over 4 million children under the age of 17 have been vaccinated. And that's a pretty incredible number, I think.
That's remarkable. Yeah.
Clinical trials for age 12 to 16 were in the range of 12 to 20,000 for the clinical trials. For the ages of 2 to 12, they're shooting for 4,000 by Moderna and I think 6,000 by Pfizer. And they're doing it in an incremental fashion. In other words, they're doing the 10 to 12-year-olds first. And if that's safe, they go to the 8 to 10 years old and de-escalate with the age. So I think they're being remarkably attentive to the safety needs of the children and the parents.
And thinking about the long-term effects, what do we know about the long-term effects of these vaccines on children?
You mean specifically about the RNA vaccines or
Yes.
just vaccines in general?
Specifically to the RNA vaccines. What do we know about the long-term effects on children?
I think it's too early. I mean, I think as Sina has referred to early, even in the adults, it's been about a year. I'm sure with some of the earlier clinical trials in this age group, it's probably been that time frame as well. So, a year out, I think they're still fairly safe. But, and in all honesty, I don't envision there will be any issues. Again, I think this is a pretty straightforward vaccine that shouldn't have too many side effects, except what you see in the beginning, the sore arm and those type of things.
Yeah,
but
I agree with
early
Teri. I
on.
mean, this is a type of vaccine, unlike live attenuated vaccines. These type of vaccines actually, they're gone within hours, basically. After they make the protein, then they die off and they're gone. So the long-term effect, I don't really know what it could be, except if it's something very, very unusual under very unusual circumstances that you may see something. I don't know what it could be. As I said, in the safety of them, really, if you think about the live attenuated vaccines, that is, I think it's far harsher to receive those type of vaccines than something that dies off after hours.
So as you all talk about this, it seems like a no-brainer, right? The safety and cleanliness of these vaccines, I mean, they're really elegant, to be honest. And so, in this conversation, if I wasn't already convinced, it seems like, well, obviously this is what we should be doing. And yet, there are lots of people who would argue, given the low risk of COVID to children, why not wait? Why not collect more data? So, Stephen, I'd like you, if you could, to talk to us a little bit about, maybe expand on what COVID can actually do to children and the impact. And Sina mentioned this earlier about, children live in households that have other people of other age ranges and risk cohorts. So, what would be your argument for those people who say, well, they're at low risk, we can put this off or not do this in children?
I think the first number to quote is there are 306 confirmed deaths from COVID-19 in children, with a probable estimation of about 600. That doesn't sound like a lot. It's less than 1%. But if that's your child, that's a very real event. So I think the first thing that the vaccines do as a long-term side effect is keep the child alive. We're finding with COVID also that there is the Kawasaki-like multi-system inflammatory syndrome, in which the children are very sick, and you've had centers set up, special clinical units to treat this. We're also finding that long COVID seems to be more common with children than with adults, to the point that Rainbow Children's Hospital in Cleveland has set up a dedicated unit to study it, and I think other universities will be doing the same thing in the near future. So it's not a trifling event. And to characterize it as such is really misinformation that unfortunately has been put out there. Recently, Kaiser did a poll where 30% of the parents said they would immediately vaccinate, 26% would wait, 18% only if required, and 23% absolute refusal. That's not checking in with the child, though. In my experience, is the children are more receptive than their parents. They want to be free.
I've actually seen a couple articles written about conflict in the home and how to handle such when children want one thing and parents want another. So let's take a step back if we can and really then think about the overall impact on society and the importance of vaccinating children. What happens if we do and we don't? Sort of what are the different case scenarios that we're looking at if more parents make this decision to vaccinate or less parents make that decision? I mean, really for school to start in the fall, and in a lot of schools, I think New York just announced that there will be no virtual learning in the fall. So, we're down to just a few months for parents to not only make the decision, but to be active in participating. And so, what are the benefits to society if we move forward with vaccination, and what are the risks if we don't?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to think about is that, children can transmit the virus. They can be spreaders. And typically they haven't been super spreaders, but I think recent news has shown that some of the new variants seem to be being spread quicker with children now. So I think we have to outweigh the risks versus the benefits. And so I think that, people are taking the approach, well, I'm vaccinated, so my children don't need to be. And that's great if you're only going to stay inside your house. But we want to send our kids to camps. We want to go on vacations now. And as you said, school starts in the fall. So we need to not be selfish. And I think, to that point, we have to realize it's not just protecting the kids from getting COVID, but it's protecting everybody from getting COVID who choose not to get vaccinated. And I think that needs to be really an important takeaway.
So
I think it's important to go ahead.
Go ahead, Stephen. Go. Okay, so let's turn this a little bit differently. Yeah. So, and I know there is still vaccine hesitancy, even for diseases that has some high case fatalities. Okay, so let's put that subject aside. What would happen if this virus was actually the case fatality rate in children was high, 40%, 30%? Do we believe that this group that are so hesitant to get the kids vaccinated, would they still support that idea, or would they change their mind? Now, the reason I'm bringing this up because the current variant that is circulating in the United States, as Stephen said, the case fatality rate is less than 1%. How about the new variants that are arriving in the United States? The case fatality rate goes up to 2 or 3 or 5% or 10%. I think what we're trying to do here is not just to stop the current coronavirus outbreak. We are actually trying to stop the future coronavirus outbreak also, which is the variant dependent. And I think if we don't stop that, the future one, I think we're not going to do our kids any favors, because they're going to be in this situation for years to come.
I think it's important to recognize that kids need to get back into school.
Yes.
It's got to be the ultimate priority of our society at the current time. They have been set back a year. Their social development, their interpersonal relationships, their ability to learn has been severely compromised. And unfortunately, it is disproportional with various socioeconomic groups are getting hurt worse. And I think it's critical that we do everything we can to get the schools open. We can test to open, we can vaccinate to open. I think it's critical to use this tool to make sure our children go through school this year without interruptions and without computers, doing at home virtual learning. They need to be in school, and that has got to be our ultimate priority.
Thank you all. Those are a lot of compelling points. So for my last question for all of you, I'd like to wrap up asking a bit about misinformation. I mean, you painted a picture of why this is important, why, I mean, for individuals, children, families, societies, entire school systems, we need to be moving forward with vaccines in children, but there is so much misinformation out there. And so how do we ensure that people are getting the right information and that parents are making informed decisions, or children are helping in the process of making informed decisions? How do we combat the misinformation? I know it's a near impossible question, but in your opinion, and Teri, I'll start with you because I see you laughing.
Yeah, well, I mean, social media has been the death of all of us to some degree, probably more for children, because it really allows anyone and everyone to put out information that isn't correct. But amazingly, there's a lot of people who will read that and well, that's got to be right. And I bring that up because, again, some of the questions that have been asked of me is, well, I've heard that this vaccine has an effect on fertility, so I'm not going to get my daughter vaccinated. That type of misinformation has been with just about every vaccine that's ever been developed. And there's never been any truth to it. But unfortunately, it's on social media. And so, there's a number of people who choose to believe it. I think that's the big question out there, not just for the vaccines, but, for many things, is how do you combat that misinformation? That's why those of us on here who are, part of Why We Vax are attempting to try to set the record straight the best that we can. And I think it's important because, again, we need to use social media to, help straighten out that misinformation, because there are things out there like the fertility issues. And I'm sure there's more than that. That just seems to be one that I get asked a lot.
To validate your exact point, I'll just say, as someone who's in that process, and my husband and I have been approached from people on both sides of our family saying we shouldn't because it could hurt our chances or it could do something. Like we've had our own challenges with family of saying this is our decision and we, here's why. And I'm sometimes like, I have a doctorate and yet they're still planting these seeds in my own head of, well, wait, I know the literature, I know the data, and yet I keep hearing all these people say, I mean, it's, I think fertility is a really great example of what's happening. And it just takes a question.
Right.
To send.
I think it's important at this time to re-empower the primary care physician, the pediatrician, the family practitioner, the nurse practitioner. They are the best source of information for the patients. And it's remarkable how many patients who will come in with misinformation with a simple couple-minute discussion in your office will go, oh, let's get vaccinated. But we need to get back to empowering that group of people. I'm also concerned that the anti-vax movement with COVID is breathing oxygen into the general anti-vax movement, and that it will increase resistance to all vaccines as a byproduct. And that frightens me a bit.
Yeah. So I actually agree with what Stephen just said about allowing actually the primary practitioners to really be some of the spokespeople for this one. So my wife, she's a family practitioner, and so she's in constant contact, obviously, with people who are hesitating to do this. And her first defense is, if there were any problem with fertilities in future for your daughters, do you think I would actually vaccinate my own daughters? 2 daughters got vaccinated, so at their prime age. So I think these are the type of example you want to keep bringing up and keep trying to tell people that if we are able to vaccinate, or if you're willingly vaccinating our own kids, that should say something about these type of vaccines. So we believe in it enough, based on our knowledge, that both scientists sit around the table at nighttime and we discuss these, and we still came up with the conclusion it is a lot safer to get the vaccine than to not get the vaccine and deal with the consequence of the infection, which, as Stephen said, is far worse than getting the vaccination.
And I think that right there, I think that was the perfect ending, Sina, that really sums up the entire conversation we've had, which is the benefits outweigh the risks.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, and then there's complete consensus on that. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for joining today and all of you watching. For another roundtable discussion here on VaxTalks. And if you want more information about all the things we talked about today, or you have other specific questions, there are lots of videos and Q&As. If you go to whywevax.org. So I highly encourage you to visit whywevax.org and be sure to check back for other VaxTalks conversations.